The birthday party was supposed to be an ordinary family gathering. One of those events where time blurs past grievances and everyone pretends that history has softened its sharpest edges. I arrived believing, or perhaps hoping, that this evening might feel different. The venue was decorated carefully, lights arranged to create warmth, music chosen to feel celebratory rather than loud. On the surface, everything suggested joy, yet beneath that polished atmosphere, something old and familiar waited for me. The same quiet dismissal that had followed me for as long as I could remember. I arrived early, not because I was eager to socialize, but because I had been asked to help. That request alone carried an unspoken expectation, while others drifted in later to enjoy themselves. I stepped into a role that felt predetermined. No one questioned why I was the one setting things up or preparing food. It felt natural to them, and unsettlingly familiar to me. I told myself it was harmless, that helping did not mean diminishing myself, but my body recognized the pattern long before my mind wanted to admit it. As the party filled with relatives, laughter and conversation circled around the room, yet rarely landed on me. Smiles passed over my shoulder. Conversations paused when I approached and resumed once I stepped away. I existed on the edges, visible only when something needed to be done. That quiet exclusion hurt more than open hostility ever could, because it was subtle enough for others to deny, while still being powerful enough to remind me of my place. When I was sent outside to manage the grill, the moment felt symbolic. I stood alone with smoke curling around me, separated from the warmth and noise inside. It was there, away from the crowd, that the evening crossed a line it could never return from. I heard laughter behind me, sharper and more deliberate than the casual humor of celebration. When I turned, I saw a phone raised toward me, recording, framing me as something to be observed rather than respected. The words spoken in that moment were not new. They echoed sentiments that had existed quietly for years. Now given a public stage, being labeled the family failure was not shocking, but hearing it said so casually, so proudly, shattered something in me. What hurt most was not just the insult, but the ease with which it was delivered, as if it were an accepted truth everyone understood. The laughter that followed confirmed what I had long suspected. My role in the family narrative had already been written, and humiliation was considered entertainment. When my phone buzzed with notifications, the weight of that realization settled fully. The comments that appeared on my screen came from people who had shared meals with me, who had smiled moments earlier. Their words carried no hesitation, no empathy. They laughed along, reinforcing the idea that my discomfort was deserved, even amusing. In that instant, the years of silent disrespect condensed into a single moment of clarity. This was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was the natural outcome of a dynamic that had gone unchallenged for too long. I did not argue. I did not explain. I simply removed myself. Leaving the party felt less like an exit and more like a decision, one shaped by years of swallowing pain quietly. Placing the gift down before walking away was not an act of spite, but of finality. It was the last thing I offered before choosing myself. The silence that followed me out of the venue was heavier than the laughter I left behind, yet it felt strangely grounding. That night, alone in my apartment, the reality of what had happened settled slowly. The humiliation stung, but beneath it was something stronger. Recognition. The party had not created the disrespect. It had merely exposed it in a way that could no longer be ignored or excused. What I felt was not just hurt, but resolve. For the first time, I understood that enduring quiet mistreatment was not loyalty, and that staying silent had never protected me. The birthday party became a turning point, not because of cruelty alone, but because it stripped away the illusion that things might change if I tried harder or stayed smaller. It showed me that disrespect thrives when it is normalized, when no one is willing to interrupt it. Walking away that night marked the beginning of a different choice, one rooted not in anger, but in self-respect. The laughter behind me faded, but the clarity I gained that evening stayed, reshaping how I saw my family, my role, and my right to step away from spaces where my dignity was treated as disposable. Growing up invisible in a family built on comparison shapes a person in ways that are often difficult to explain, but deeply felt in every corner of their life. From an early age, love and approval feel conditional, measured not by who you are, but by how closely you resemble someone else's achievements, personality, or choices. Childhood becomes less about discovery and more about quiet observation, learning which traits are praised and which are ignored. You quickly understand that attention is a limited resource, and it is rarely given freely. Instead, it is distributed through comparisons that rank worth and determine who is seen and who fades into the background. In such families, achievements are never simply achievements. They are weighed against siblings, cousins, or even idealized versions of what a child should be. A good grade is acknowledged only if it surpasses someone else's. A personal interest is dismissed if it does not align with what another family member does better. Over time, this constant measuring creates an internal narrative that being yourself is not enough. You begin to edit your personality, downplay your needs, and silence your voice in hopes of avoiding unfavorable comparison. Invisibility becomes a form of protection, a way to survive without drawing criticism or disappointment. Emotional needs are often overlooked in families built on comparison. Praise flows toward those who reflect the family's chosen image of success, while others are expected to adapt quietly. When you struggle, your pain is minimized by reminders that someone else has it worse or handles things better. When you succeed, the moment is brief, quickly redirected to how it could have been more impressive. This teaches a child that emotions are inconvenient and that vulnerability is risky. Feelings are swallowed, not because they disappear, but because expressing them rarely leads to comfort or understanding. Growing up invisible also means learning to become hyper-aware of others. You notice shifts in tone, small expressions, and subtle signs of approval or disapproval. This awareness often turns into people-pleasing, an attempt to anticipate needs before they are voiced. You learn to be useful, agreeable, and undemanding. While this may earn occasional approval, it reinforces the belief that your value lies in what you provide rather than who you are. Your own desires feel secondary, sometimes even selfish, compared to maintaining harmony or meeting expectations set by comparison. As years pass, invisibility follows you beyond childhood. In adulthood, you may struggle to recognize your own accomplishments without external validation. Compliments feel uncomfortable or undeserved. You may compare yourself relentlessly to others, repeating the same patterns that once diminished you. Relationships can feel unbalanced, as you give more than you receive, unconsciously recreating familiar dynamics. The fear of being overlooked again can drive perfectionism or, conversely, a reluctance to try at all, because failure feels like confirmation of long-held doubts. There is also grief in growing up this way, a quiet mourning for the version of yourself that might have emerged in an environment of unconditional support. You may grieve the child who learned too early to stay small, to speak less, to expect little. This grief is often unacknowledged because comparison taught you that your experiences were never significant enough to name. Yet it lingers, surfacing in moments of self-doubt or exhaustion, reminding you of years spent unseen. Despite this, growing up invisible can also cultivate deep empathy and resilience. Being overlooked sharpens emotional intelligence and teaches patience, reflection, and strength. Many who grow up in comparison-based families develop a profound understanding of others' struggles, precisely because their own were ignored. When awareness replaces self-blame, invisibility begins to lose its power. You start to see that the problem was never a lack of worth, but a system that measured love incorrectly. Healing involves learning to exist without comparison, to define success and happiness on your own terms. It requires giving yourself the attention you were denied and allowing your voice to take up space without apology. While the past cannot be rewritten, the narrative can change. Growing up invisible does not mean remaining unseen forever. It means recognizing that visibility begins within. When you finally choose to see yourself clearly and claim the value that was always there, even when no one else acknowledged it. Writing. Learning to shrink myself to keep the peace became a quiet survival skill long before I ever had words for it. It did not arrive as a single decision, but as a gradual understanding that harmony in my world depended on how little space I occupied. I learned that silence was safer than honesty, that compliance was rewarded more often than authenticity, and that minimizing my needs made me easier to tolerate. Over time, this shrinking felt less like a choice and more like a requirement for belonging. At first, it looked like small compromises. I softened my opinions so they would not sound confrontational. I laughed off comments that hurt because challenging them would disrupt the calm. I learned to read the room instinctively, adjusting my tone, posture, and expressions to match what was expected of me. Each adjustment seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern of self-erasure. Peace was maintained, but it came at the cost of my own voice. Emotional restraint became a defining trait. I learned to filter my feelings, allowing only the ones that felt acceptable to surface. Anger was dangerous because it made others uncomfortable. Sadness was inconvenient unless it could be quickly resolved. Joy was tempered so it would not appear boastful or excessive. I became skilled at presenting a version of myself that was easy to be around, even when it meant leaving my true emotions unexpressed. The more I suppressed, the more normal this suppression felt. Conflict avoidance reinforced the habit of shrinking. Whenever tension arose, I was the one expected to smooth it over, to apologize first, or to let things go. My role became that of the peacemaker. Even when the conflict was not of my making, I internalized the belief that disagreement equaled danger, and that asserting myself would lead to rejection or withdrawal of affection. To prevent that, I learned to bend, adapt, and absorb discomfort quietly. As time passed, shrinking shaped my identity. I struggled to articulate what I wanted because I had spent so long prioritizing what others needed. Decision-making felt overwhelming. As I questioned whether my preferences were valid or worth voicing, I became accustomed to being overlooked, telling myself it did not matter, that keeping the peace was more important than being seen. Yet beneath that calm exterior, resentment slowly accumulated, unspoken and unresolved. This pattern followed me into adulthood, influencing friendships, work environments, and romantic relationships. I gravitated toward roles where I was needed, but not necessarily valued, repeating familiar dynamics. I overextended myself, saying yes when I meant no, fearing that boundaries would disrupt the fragile balance I had learned to protect. Even in moments of success, I hesitated to celebrate fully, worried that standing out would invite criticism or discomfort. The cost of shrinking eventually became impossible to ignore. Exhaustion set in, not from doing too much, but from constantly monitoring myself. I felt disconnected from my own identity, unsure where others' expectations ended and I began. The peace I had worked so hard to maintain felt hollow, sustained by my silence rather than mutual respect. I began to realize that harmony built on self-denial is not true peace, but quiet resentment disguised as stability. Unlearning this habit required discomfort. Allowing myself to take up space felt unnatural and even selfish at first. Speaking honestly caused anxiety, as though I were breaking an unspoken rule. Yet each small act of self-expression brought clarity. I discovered that my needs were not excessive, my feelings not unreasonable. The world did not collapse when I voiced disagreement, and those who valued me adjusted rather than withdrew. Learning to stop shrinking did not mean becoming loud or confrontational. It meant existing fully, without apology, and trusting that real peace includes everyone, not just those who speak the loudest. By reclaiming my voice, I learned that keeping the peace should never require the disappearance of the self. True harmony emerges when presence is allowed, not when identity is sacrificed for silence. Leaving home and building a life without validation was not a dramatic exit filled with certainty and relief. It was a quiet, unsettling process shaped by doubt, guilt, and a longing for permission that never came. For a long time, home had been the place where approval determined worth, where every choice was measured against expectations. and where validation felt like something that had to be earned repeatedly. Walking away from that environment meant stepping into a life where familiar rules no longer applied, and where the absence of constant judgment felt both freeing and terrifying. The decision to leave was born out of emotional exhaustion rather than rebellion. Staying had required continuous explanation, justification, and self-adjustment. Every goal had to be approved, every boundary negotiated, and every success evaluated through someone else's lens. Over time, the effort to be understood became heavier than the fear of standing alone. Leaving meant choosing uncertainty over suffocation. Even without a clear vision of what independence would look like beyond the walls I knew so well, the early days away from home were marked by silence that felt unfamiliar. Without constant feedback, I struggled to trust my own decisions. Simple choices felt overwhelming because there was no one to tell me whether I was doing the right thing. I noticed how deeply validation had shaped my sense of self. Approval had once acted as a compass, and without it, I felt temporarily directionless. Yet within that discomfort, there was also space, room to listen to thoughts and feelings that had long been drowned out. Building a life without validation required redefining success from the ground up. Instead of asking whether my choices would be accepted, I began asking whether they aligned with my values. Progress became internal rather than performative. I learned to measure growth by peace of mind, consistency, and self-respect instead of praise. This shift was slow and uneven, but it introduced a new kind of stability that did not depend on anyone else's opinion. Loneliness was an unavoidable part of this transition. There were moments when I missed the familiarity of home, even with all its conditions and limitations. Detaching from validation meant accepting that some relationships would change or fade entirely. The loss of approval felt like a loss of connection, and there were days when I questioned whether independence was worth the distance it created. Yet with time, I recognized that being close at the cost of self-erasure was not true connection. As independence grew, so did confidence in small, quiet ways. I learned to celebrate my own efforts, even when no one else noticed. Mistakes became opportunities for learning rather than proof of inadequacy. I allowed myself to experiment, to change direction, and to evolve without needing reassurance. Each self-directed decision strengthened trust in my own judgment, gradually replacing the need for external validation with self-approval. This process also revealed how deeply ingrained the need for validation had been. Even in new environments, I sometimes caught myself seeking approval from authority figures or peers. Recognizing these patterns was not a failure, but a reminder of how long I had relied on external affirmation to feel secure. With awareness, I learned to pause, reflect, and choose differently, reinforcing the belief that my worth did not fluctuate with others. Responses. Leaving home was not about rejecting where I came from, but about reclaiming ownership of who I was becoming. Building a life without validation meant learning to stand steady without applause, to move forward without constant reassurance, and to trust that my choices were valid simply because they were mine. Over time, independence stopped feeling like isolation and began to feel like freedom. In that freedom, I found a sense of belonging that came not from being approved of, but from being fully and unapologetically myself. Hope for change often arrives quietly, especially after long periods of disappointment. It does not announce itself with certainty or promise immediate transformation. Instead, it begins as a fragile belief that things could be different, even when experience suggests otherwise. For a long time, hope felt risky, something that led only to repeated letdowns. Expecting change meant opening the door to pain again, so it was easier to settle into acceptance, to assume that patterns would remain fixed and that growth was something meant for others. Living without hope created a sense of emotional stagnation. Days blended together, shaped by familiar dynamics and unspoken rules. Change felt theoretical, discussed but never realized. Even when apologies were offered or intentions expressed, they rarely led to lasting shifts. Over time, skepticism replaced optimism, and hope was stored away as a form of self-protection. Believing in change required vulnerability. and vulnerability had often been met with disappointment rather than care. The gift that changed everything did not come wrapped in grand gestures or dramatic apologies. It arrived unexpectedly, in a form that seemed simple at first. What made it powerful was not its appearance but its meaning. It was the first genuine acknowledgement of effort, pain, and persistence without conditions attached. For once, the gesture did not ask for anything in return. It did not demand gratitude, forgiveness, or compliance. It simply existed as recognition, and that alone was transformative. Receiving that gift stirred emotions that had long been buried. There was gratitude, but also confusion, and even grief for all the times such recognition had been absent. It forced a confrontation with the belief that change was impossible. The moment did not erase the past or undo years of hurt, but it disrupted the certainty that nothing could ever be different. In that disruption, hope found space to reemerge. Cautious but present, hope after long disappointment is not naive. It does not erase boundaries or ignore history. Instead, it becomes more grounded, less dependent on ideal outcomes. The gift offered proof that awareness and growth were possible, even if they arrived late or imperfectly. It did not guarantee continued change, but it suggested willingness, and that was enough to soften the emotional armor built over time. This renewed hope changed how the future was approached. Rather than expecting immediate transformation, there was room for gradual progress. Conversations became more honest, not because trust was fully restored, but because the possibility of being heard no longer felt absurd. Hope shifted from a desperate longing into a measured openness, allowing space for cautious engagement without surrendering self-protection. The gift also changed something internally. It validated the decision to keep believing in personal growth, even when external circumstances felt unyielding. It reminded me that resilience had not been wasted, that patience and self-respect still had meaning. This internal shift was perhaps the most significant change of all, as it restored faith not just in others, but in my own capacity to endure, adapt, and heal. Hope for change does not mean returning to old patterns or lowering hard-earned boundaries. It means allowing the future to remain unwritten. The gift served as a reminder that people are capable of reflection and that moments of clarity can occur even after long periods of resistance. Whether or not further change follows, the impact of that moment remains, offering reassurance that growth is possible and that hope, once thought lost, can be found again. In the end, the gift did not solve everything, nor was it meant to. Its power lay in what it represented: a break in the pattern, a signal of awareness, and a moment of genuine recognition. From that moment forward, hope no longer felt like a weakness. It became a quiet strength, carried forward with discernment, shaping a future defined not by expectation, but by possibility. Public humiliation has a way of cutting deeper than private criticism because it strips away dignity in front of witnesses. It turns personal pain into a spectacle and leaves little room to process emotions safely. In that moment, shock often overrides reaction. The mind goes blank, the body stiffens, and instinct urges silence as a form of self-preservation. Laughter, dismissal, or judgment from others can amplify the sting, making the experience feel isolating even while surrounded by people. The immediate aftermath of public humiliation is often confusion. There is an urge to minimize what happened, to convince oneself it was not that serious, or that it was deserved. This self-blame becomes a coping mechanism, a way to regain some sense of control. Accepting humiliation as justified feels easier than acknowledging the cruelty behind it. Yet beneath this rationalization, something shifts quietly. A line is crossed, even if it is not recognized right away. While the humiliation is public, the awakening that follows is deeply private. It unfolds in solitude, through reflection that happens late at night, or in moments of unexpected clarity. Replaying the incident becomes unavoidable. Details resurface with new understanding, revealing patterns that had once been ignored or excused. What initially felt like an isolated event begins to resemble a continuation of long-standing behavior. This realization can be painful, but it is also clarifying. Private awakening brings an uncomfortable honesty. It exposes how often respect was compromised to maintain connection or approval. It challenges the narratives used to justify others' actions and confronts the cost of remaining silent. There is grief in recognizing how long mistreatment was normalized, and anger in acknowledging the self that was repeatedly dismissed. Yet this awareness also restores agency. For the first time, the experience is named accurately, without minimizing or deflecting. With awakening comes a shift in perspective. The humiliation no longer defines personal worth, but instead highlights the boundaries that were missing. Attention turns inward, toward self-respect rather than external validation. The question changes from, "Why did this happen to me?" to, "What was I no longer allow?" This shift marks the beginning of reclaiming control, not by confrontation alone, but through deliberate choices about access and behavior. Firm boundaries emerge as a response to clarity, not bitterness. They are not built to punish, but to protect. Establishing them requires courage, especially when the other party is accustomed to unchecked behavior. Boundaries may be met with resistance, disbelief, or attempts to dismiss their importance. Holding them steady becomes an act of self-trust, reinforcing the understanding that dignity does not need to be negotiated. The presence of boundaries often changes relationships, sometimes permanently. Some connections adapt, adjusting to the new limits with respect. Others fall away, unable or unwilling to operate without dominance or disregard. While this loss can be painful, it also brings relief. The absence of constant anxiety and self-monitoring creates space for peace, even if it arrives alongside grief. Public humiliation once felt like an endpoint, a moment of irreversible damage. In reality, it became a catalyst. The private awakening it triggered led to a clearer sense of self and a deeper commitment to personal integrity. Firm boundaries transformed pain into direction, ensuring that dignity would no longer be sacrificed for acceptance. What was once a moment of exposure ultimately became a moment of empowerment, marking the transition from endurance to self-respect. Walking away to reclaim dignity, peace, and self-worth is rarely an impulsive act. It is the final step in a long internal journey marked by endurance, self-questioning, and repeated attempts to make things work. For a long time, staying feels like strength. Endurance is praised, patience is encouraged, and leaving is framed as failure or weakness. Under these beliefs, walking away becomes something to postpone, even when the cost of staying grows heavier with each passing day. The decision begins quietly, often after a moment of clarity that exposes how much has been tolerated. It may come after a conversation that goes nowhere, a boundary that is ignored, or a realization that respect is consistently absent. At first, the truth is uncomfortable. Acknowledging that a situation is damaging means accepting that effort alone cannot fix it. This awareness challenges deeply held beliefs about loyalty, responsibility, and hope. Walking away requires confronting fear. There is fear of being misunderstood, judged, or blamed. There is fear of loneliness and uncertainty, of losing familiarity even when it is painful. For many, there is also fear of guilt, especially if they have been conditioned to prioritize others' needs over their own. Leaving feels selfish, even when staying has demanded self-erasure. Yet beneath the fear, there is a growing understanding that self-respect cannot coexist with ongoing harm. The act of walking away is both physical and emotional. It may involve distancing from people, environments, or roles that once defined daily life. This separation can feel disorienting, as identity has often been shaped by what was endured rather than who one truly is. In the absence of constant conflict or judgment, there is an unfamiliar quiet. At first, this quiet can feel empty, but over time, it becomes restorative. Reclaiming dignity means refusing to participate in dynamics that diminish self-worth. It is the decision to stop explaining pain to those unwilling to listen and to stop seeking validation from those who withhold it. Dignity is restored through consistent self-alignment, choosing actions that reflect inner values rather than external pressure. Each moment of self-respect reinforces the belief that worth is inherent, not conditional. Peace follows gradually. It is not immediate relief, but a slow release of tension held for too long. The nervous system begins to relax as vigilance is no longer required. There is space to breathe, think, and exist without anticipating conflict. Peace is found in ordinary moments, in the absence of dread, and in the ability to make choices without fear of retaliation or dismissal. Self-worth grows through lived experience. By honoring boundaries and protecting emotional well-being, confidence rebuilds naturally. Mistakes are no longer used as evidence of inadequacy, but as part of learning and growth. Walking away teaches that value is not measured by how much one can tolerate, but by how well one can care for oneself. The aftermath of walking away may include grief for what was hoped for but never realized. There may be moments of doubt, questioning whether leaving was the right choice. These moments are part of healing, not signs of failure. With time, perspective deepens, and the reasons for leaving become clearer, reaffirming the decision. Walking away is not about closing the heart or hardening the spirit. It is about choosing a life where dignity is non-negotiable. Peace is prioritized, and self-worth is honored. By stepping away from what harms, space is created for what heals. In that space, strength is redefined, not as endurance of pain, but as the courage to protect one's well-being and move forward with integrity.